My brother stole my $10 K watch, then asked for a loan. I never thought my own brother would betray me like this. The watch was sitting on my nightstand that Tuesday morning, and by evening it was gone. I'd saved for 2 years to buy that timepiece, working double shifts and skipping vacations. It wasn't just expensive, it was a symbol of everything I'd worked for. The weight of it on my wrist reminded me daily that hard work pays off. But when I came home from work that day, the empty spot on my nightstand felt like a punch to the gut. My first instinct was to check if maybe I'd moved it somewhere else. I tore through every drawer, every pocket, every possible hiding spot in my apartment. Nothing. The sick feeling in my stomach grew worse with each passing minute. Only 3 people had keys to my place: my landlord, my girlfriend, and my brother. The landlord was an elderly man who'd never shown interest in anything beyond collecting rent. My girlfriend was out of town visiting her sister. That left only one possibility, and I didn't want to believe it. I called my brother immediately, trying to keep my voice steady. He answered on the third ring, sounding perfectly normal. When I asked if he'd seen my watch, he claimed he hadn't even noticed it was missing. His voice didn't waver, didn't change pitch. Either he was telling the truth, or he was a better liar than I'd ever imagined. We talked for another few minutes about random things, and I hung up feeling confused and desperate. Maybe someone had broken in without any signs of forced entry. Maybe I was losing my mind. The next morning brought a text from my cousin that changed everything. She'd seen my brother at a pawn shop downtown, looking nervous and glancing around constantly. He'd been carrying a small box and seemed to be in a hurry. The description matched the jewelry box I kept my watch in perfectly. My hands shook as I read her message 3 times, hoping somehow the words would change. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft, it was a violation of trust that cut deeper than any stranger's crime could have. I drove to the pawn shop immediately, my heart pounding with each mile. The owner, a gruff man with thick glasses, remembered my brother perfectly. He'd sold a watch matching my description just hours after my cousin had seen him there. The man showed me the paperwork, and there was my brother's signature, clear as day. He'd gotten $3,000 for something worth more than 3 times that amount. The pawn shop owner seemed genuinely sympathetic when I explained the situation, but legally there was nothing he could do without a police report. Standing in that dusty shop, surrounded by other people's desperate sales and broken dreams, I felt a rage I'd never experienced before. My brother had not only stolen from me, he'd sold my most prized possession for a fraction of its worth. The watch was probably already gone, sold to some collector who had no idea it was stolen. I took photos of all the paperwork, thanked the owner, and walked back to my car on unsteady legs. The drive home was a blur of anger, hurt, and disbelief. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the empty nightstand and trying to process what had happened. My brother and I had our differences over the years, but I'd never imagined he was capable of something like this. We'd grown up sharing everything, from toys to secrets to dreams about the future. Somewhere along the way, he'd become someone I didn't recognize. The man who'd stolen my watch wasn't the same person who'd helped me move apartments last year or who'd called to check on me when I was sick. I spent the next week avoiding his calls and texts. Every time his name appeared on my phone, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness that made it impossible to respond. He left voicemails asking if I was okay, saying he was worried about me. The irony was almost too much to bear. How could he be worried about me when he was the one who'd devastated me? His messages became more frequent, more concerned. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, but another part wasn't ready for that conversation. My girlfriend returned from her trip and immediately noticed something was wrong. I'd been walking around like a zombie, barely eating, barely sleeping. When I finally told her what had happened, she was furious on my behalf. She wanted to drive to his house immediately and demand answers. Her anger somehow made me feel both better and worse. Better because someone else understood the magnitude of what he'd done. Worse because saying it out loud made it feel more real, more permanent. We talked for hours about what I should do next. She suggested going to the police, but I wasn't ready to take that step. Despite everything, he was still my brother. The thought of him getting arrested, of having a criminal record, of potentially going to jail made me sick. But the thought of him getting away with it made me equally sick. I was trapped between my anger and my love for him, between justice and family loyalty. It was the most difficult emotional position I'd ever been in. 2 weeks after the theft, my mother called with news that made everything infinitely more complicated. My brother had been struggling financially for months, apparently. He'd lost his previous source of income and was facing eviction from his apartment. She'd been helping him with small amounts of money, but it wasn't enough. He was behind on rent, behind on his car payment, and drowning in credit card debt. The timing wasn't a coincidence. He'd stolen my watch because he was desperate, not because he was malicious. This revelation should have made me feel better, but it somehow made everything worse. I could understand desperation, could even sympathize with it. But why hadn't he come to me for help? Why hadn't he explained his situation and asked for a loan? I would have found a way to help him, even if it meant sacrificing something myself. Instead, he'd chosen to betray me, to steal from me, to lie to me. The desperate circumstances explained his actions but didn't excuse them. My mother begged me to talk to him, to try to work things out as a family. She didn't know about the watch and I wasn't ready to tell her. The conversation would have broken her heart, and she was already worried enough about his financial situation. I promised to think about it, but every time I imagined seeing him face to face, I felt sick. How do you look someone in the eye when they've violated your trust so completely? How do you have a normal conversation when there's such a massive elephant in the room? The turning point came 3 weeks after the theft, when my phone rang at 11 at night. It was my brother, and his voice was different than I'd ever heard it before. He sounded broken, defeated, and barely coherent. He'd been drinking, that much was obvious, but there was something else in his voice that made me stay on the line. He started talking about how everything in his life was falling apart, how he felt like he was drowning in problems he couldn't solve. He didn't mention the watch, but I could hear the guilt in every word. He talked for almost an hour, mostly rambling about his failures and regrets. I barely said anything, just listened to him pour out his pain and self-hatred. By the end of the call, he was crying, something I hadn't seen him do since we were children. When he finally hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment feeling more confused than ever. The brother I'd heard on the phone sounded like he was punishing himself more than I ever could. But that didn't change what he'd done or make the betrayal hurt any less. The next morning brought a text that I read 5 times before it fully registered. He was asking me for a loan of $1,500 to help with his rent. The audacity of it was breathtaking. After stealing $10,000 worth of my property, he was asking me to give him more money. My first instinct was to respond with anger, to tell him exactly what I thought of his request. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity about how far he'd pushed this charade. Maybe it was a desire to see if he'd finally come clean about the watch. I stared at that text message for hours, my emotions cycling through anger, disbelief, and a weird sort of fascination. This was my opportunity to confront him, to force the truth out into the open. But it was also a chance to see if he'd compound his betrayal with more lies. I realized I wasn't ready to let him off the hook yet. If he wanted to play this game of pretending nothing had happened, I could play along while gathering more evidence of his deception. I responded that I'd consider the loan but would need to meet in person to discuss it. He agreed immediately, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop downtown the next afternoon. The eagerness in his response made me wonder if he really believed he could maintain his lies face to face. Or maybe he was planning to confess everything when we met. Either way, I spent the next 24 hours preparing for a conversation that would determine the future of our relationship. The coffee shop was crowded and noisy, which somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. My brother arrived 10 minutes late, looking haggard and nervous. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than his years. When he sat down across from me, I could smell alcohol on his breath even though it was the middle of the afternoon. This wasn't the confident, successful person I'd known growing up. This was someone who'd been broken by his circumstances and poor choices. He launched into a detailed explanation of his financial problems, laying out exactly how much he owed and to whom. The numbers were staggering. He was in debt far deeper than I'd realized, and the $1,500 he was asking for would barely make a dent in his problems. As he talked, I found myself feeling both sympathetic and frustrated. Here was my brother desperately asking for help, while my stolen watch was probably sitting in some collector's safe across town. When he finished his pitch, I leaned back in my chair and studied his face. This was the moment of truth. I could either confront him directly or continue the charade a little longer. Something in his expression, a flicker of guilt or fear, made me choose the direct approach. I told him I'd heard he'd been to a pawn shop recently and asked if he'd sold anything valuable. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. The confession that followed was painful to watch. He broke down completely, admitting not just to stealing my watch, but to going through my apartment looking for other valuable items. He'd been planning the theft for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity. The betrayal was even worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't a moment of desperation. It was a calculated decision to violate my trust and steal from me. He begged for forgiveness, promised to pay me back, swore he'd never do anything like it again. But his words felt empty after such a massive deception. I listened to his apologies and promises without saying much. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him exactly how much he'd hurt me. Another part wanted to get up and walk away without another word. Instead, I found myself asking practical questions about the watch, about the pawn shop, about whether there was any way to get it back. He'd spent the money immediately on debt payments, so there was no chance of buying it back. The watch was gone forever, along with what it represented. When I finally stood to leave, he grabbed my arm and begged me not to go to the police. He promised he'd find a way to make it right, to pay me back the full value of the watch. I looked at him sitting there desperate and broken, and realized I was looking at a stranger. The brother I'd grown up with would never have done this. This person was someone else entirely, someone I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I pulled my arm free and told him I needed time to think about everything he'd told me. The walk back to my car felt like it took forever. People were going about their normal lives, drinking coffee and chatting with friends, while my world had just been turned upside down again. The confirmation of what I'd already known somehow made it worse. There was no more uncertainty, no more hope that maybe I'd been wrong. My brother had looked me in the eye and lied to me for weeks while asking for more money. The betrayal was complete and undeniable. That night, I called my girlfriend and told her everything that had happened. She was furious, more angry than I'd ever seen her. She wanted me to call the police immediately to make sure he faced consequences for what he'd done. Her anger was validating, but it also made me realize how emotionally drained I was. I'd been carrying this burden for weeks, and the confrontation had taken whatever energy I had left. I wasn't ready to make any major decisions about next steps. Over the following days, my brother called and texted constantly. He sent long messages apologizing, explaining his actions, and begging for another chance. Each message was more desperate than the last. He promised to get help for his drinking, to find better ways to manage his money, to do whatever it took to rebuild my trust. But trust, once broken this completely, wasn't something that could be fixed with promises and good intentions. The damage was too deep, too fundamental. I found myself thinking about our childhood, about all the times we'd supported each other through difficult situations. We'd been genuinely close for most of our lives, sharing inside jokes and family memories that no one else could understand. That history made his betrayal even more painful. He hadn't just stolen from me, he destroyed something precious that had taken decades to build. The relationship we'd had was gone, and I wasn't sure if anything could take its place. My parents eventually learned about the situation when my mother noticed the tension between us at a family dinner. I'd been planning to keep it private, but the strain of pretending everything was normal became too much. The conversation was one of the most difficult I'd ever had. My mother cried, my father was silent for a long time, and my brother sat there looking like he wanted to disappear. The family dynamics I'd known my entire life were permanently altered in the space of a single conversation. My parents' reaction was complicated. They were disappointed in my brother, but also worried about him. They wanted to help him, but also wanted to support me. The situation put them in an impossible position, and I could see the stress it was causing them. This was another layer of damage from his actions. He hadn't just hurt me, he'd hurt our entire family. The ripple effects of his betrayal were spreading to everyone we cared about. In the weeks that followed, I had to make some difficult decisions about how to move forward. I ultimately decided not to press charges, partly because I didn't want to put my parents through the additional stress of a criminal case. But I also made it clear that our relationship was fundamentally changed. I couldn't trust him anymore, and without trust, there couldn't be a meaningful relationship. This wasn't about punishment or revenge, it was about protecting myself from further harm. The hardest part was learning to live with the loss. Not just the financial loss of the watch, but the loss of my brother as I'd known him. The person I'd grown up with, shared memories with, and trusted implicitly was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who'd proven capable of betraying me in the worst possible way. Grieving that loss while he was still alive and asking for forgiveness was one of the most confusing emotional experiences of my life. Months later, I still struggle with the aftermath of his betrayal. He's made some positive changes in his life, getting help for his drinking and finding more stable income. But these improvements don't change what he did or restore what was lost. The watch is gone forever, and with it, the trust and closeness we once shared. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choices, if I should have handled things differently. But then I remember the feeling of discovering that empty spot on my nightstand, and I know that some betrayals are too deep to overcome. The experience taught me painful lessons about trust, family, and the limits of forgiveness. It showed me that even the people closest to us are capable of devastating betrayal. But it also showed me that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can survive even the most unexpected emotional trauma. The brother I thought I knew is gone, but I'm still here, still building a life worth living. And maybe in the end, that's enough.